The story begins on a battlefield under heavy rain. Bodies of soldiers lie across the blood-soaked ground while others scream in pain. Our protagonist holds a wounded soldier and desperately cries out, unable to accept his death. He searches for a healing potion and calls for help before looking around for his friends, Cal and Lambda. Finding Lambda's lifeless body, he clenches his teeth and wonders why no one is there to help. The narrator describes him as a complete fool who devoted his entire life to the sword. Near him, a hand lies beside a sword, reminding him of the promise he made with his companions to save the world together. With tears filling his eyes, he refuses to believe they are gone and screams while holding the soldier's body. The narrator then introduces the story of two men who will one day become heroes and save the nation. The scene shifts to a bright sky over golden fields, a cozy village, and mountains in the distance. This is the Leomius territory, the frontier of the Sylvesta Empire. At the residence of Frontier Count Leonius, several people gather around a gambling table. Miguel clenches his teeth in excitement after winning and teases old man Yogi about his bad luck. Yogi insists that he still has savings and refuses to stop gambling, even though the money is meant for his granddaughter. A long, white-haired man then approaches and questions the commotion. Everyone immediately recognizes head chamberlain Lota and becomes nervous. Lota reprimands them for gambling inside the household of a frontier count, and reminds them to keep their brakes under control since the count will soon return. Miguel announces that the next round will be the final one. A young boy named Alpha steps forward and asks everyone to place their bets for the finale. He takes out a red box containing the winning prize and begins rapidly switching several boxes around. The gamblers struggle to follow his movements. Even old man Yogi loses track of the boxes, while head chamberlain Lota notices that Alpha is even switching them within his hands. Alpha finally places the boxes in a straight line and invites everyone to make their bets. The gamblers begin placing their coins. Yogi chooses the middle box, while Miguel studies the situation and realizes that if Yogi, who has been losing all day, chooses the middle, the winning box is likely to be one of the others. Miguel places his own bet, while Lota observes that the payout makes Miguel's strategy clever. Betting 10 coins on the left would give him a threefold return, while his other bet provides additional insurance. Lota also recognizes that Miguel's intuition is usually reliable. The winning box should be the left one, where Miguel placed his 10 coins. With the stakes set, Yogi becomes anxious because losing would cost him 5 days' worth of food and his granddaughter's allowance. He clasps his hands and desperately prays for the middle box. Alpha picks up a box and reveals that the winning box is the middle one. Old man Yogi hits the jackpot at the last moment. Lota is shocked while Yogi celebrates and gathers his winnings, relieved that he managed to avoid losing everything. Miguel realizes that he misread the situation but congratulates Yogi before telling everyone to return to work. Yogi tosses a coin to Alpha as a tip. Alpha catches it and happily thanks him before placing the red box into his bag. As Alpha prepares to leave, Lota approaches and points out that the winning box should have been the one on the left. Alpha realizes that Lota noticed the trick. Lota confirms that Alpha must have switched the boxes during the game. Alpha simply smiles, asks him to keep it quiet, and walks away with his bag. Lota watches him leave, still wondering when Alpha managed to switch the boxes. The scene shifts to the horse groom, where the workers are taking care of the horses. Alpha introduces himself as a servant of the Leonius Frontier Count's estate, specifically a horse groom. However, his real name is Shiba Tui. In his previous life, he was a legendary gambler known in underground casinos as the God of Pestilence. He had lived a stimulating life filled with money, women, and alcohol, but earning too much money created enemies on every side, eventually leading to his pathetic death in a back alley. After that, he suddenly found himself reincarnated in another world. At first, he was surprised to discover a low-level civilization without televisions, smartphones, skyscrapers, or traffic. To make matters worse, he had been reincarnated in the frontier, where most residents survived through agriculture, forestry, and mining. Although the Lord's mansion was grand, everyday life remained monotonous. People went to sleep when darkness fell, and Alpha spent his days handling repetitive chores in a world almost completely devoid of stimulation. His thoughts are interrupted when the workers announce that the master has returned. A group of riders arrives with their horses, and the scene focuses on a young man with white hair and gray eyes riding a white horse. He is Sigma Leonius, the frontier count. Alpha explains that his master is one of the Empire's most prominent swordsmen. 3 years earlier, Sigma earned great military merit during the Gulf campaign and was granted the title of frontier count in the Empire's northeast. He personally led elite troops into the heart of the enemy army and reportedly took the enemy general's head himself. His single-handed kills exceeded 1,000 soldiers, many of whom were said to have been decapitated with a single stroke. Even his allies feared his merciless swordsmanship, earning him the alias the Cold-Blooded Decapitator. However, Alpha explains that Sigma is considered useless at anything unrelated to swords and warfare. He knows little about domestic politics and leaves the management of the territory to his subordinates, leading to rumors that he is nothing more than a sword-obsessed noble. A worker calls out to Alpha and tells him to put the master's horse in the stable. Alpha immediately rushes over and approaches Sigma Leonius. He bows as Sigma dismounts from the horse. Holding the horse's reins, Alpha is terrified. As the lowest-ranking servant, he has never even spoken directly to the Lord before. Suddenly, the horse pulls Alpha. Alpha turns back and tells the horse to stop messing with him. A blonde-haired worker jokes that the noble steed must have taken a liking to him. Alpha disagrees, pointing out that the horse bites without mercy, while Miguel laughs and suggests it probably thinks Alpha is one of its underlings. From a distance, Lord Sigma watches them carefully. As Sigma approaches the entrance, a guard asks if something is wrong. Sigma simply says no. While continuing his work, Alpha reflects on how this world has far less stimulation than his previous life. Despite that, he has grown to enjoy living here. His former life in gambling was exciting but filled with betrayal and fraud, leaving him lonely. Here, he is surrounded by good-natured companions, never worries about food or shelter, and has adapted to the physical work. For Alpha, enjoying the small changes in himself and the people around him feels closer to what a real life should be. After finishing his work, Alpha is given free time until evening. He agrees and soon climbs a tree, settling on a rooftop with a book. Reading is Alpha's greatest pleasure in this world. The book he had with him when he was reincarnated is titled History of the Empire's Rise and Fall. It records 300 years of history, from the founding to the fall of the Sylvester Empire, including the imperial family, noble lineages, changing borders, and neighboring nations. Through it, Alpha has gained a basic understanding of the world's civilization and political situation. However, the most important part is that the book also records events that have not happened yet. According to it, the Sylvester Empire will be invaded by a neighboring nation and cease to exist in only 3 years. The book also contains a brief history of the Leonius family. It states that Sigma, citing financial difficulties, will eventually hand over his title and territory to his uncle and join the war as a commoner knight. He will fight across multiple regions for the struggling imperial army and eventually earn the title of the continent's strongest swordsman. However, during peace negotiations, the neighboring nation will demand Sigma's life as a condition for a ceasefire. The Empire will accept, and the continent's strongest swordsman will meet his end on an execution block rather than a battlefield. Afterward, the Empire will be invaded again and completely destroyed. Alpha finds the future unpleasant. Since Sigma cannot be defeated on the battlefield, his enemies will eliminate him through politics, while the Empire will sacrifice him simply to protect itself. With only a few peaceful years remaining, Alpha considers eventually leaving for another country before things become dangerous. His thoughts are interrupted by the sound of repeated strikes. Alpha notices Lord Sigma practicing with a wooden sword. Sigma has been sparring with his subordinates and conducting mock cavalry battles since early morning, and even after a long ride, he immediately begins training alone. Alpha realizes that Sigma truly is obsessed with the sword. He wonders how many times Sigma has repeated the same training since childhood. Instead of enjoying an easy life as a noble's son, Sigma has pushed his body and swordsmanship beyond ordinary limits, fought through bloody battlefields, and continued training even during peacetime to prepare for the next war. Alpha knows that Sigma will eventually earn the title of the continent's strongest swordsman, only for that achievement to shorten his life. He considers calling out to Sigma but remains silent, finding the fate too tragic. Night falls, and the rooms of the Frontier Count's residence light up. Alpha enters carrying a box of onions and delivers them to the maids preparing dinner. Looking at the large spread of dishes, he notices that the meal is unusually lavish. The maids explain that they have a guest. Suddenly, a loud argument comes from another room. Alpha recognizes Head Chamberlain Lota's voice and approaches to see what is happening. Inside, Lota is discussing the family's financial difficulties with Lord Sigma and an older man named Mido Leonius. Lota explains that the family's financial problems are largely caused by crop failures from the cold weather, and insists that Sigma's management is not to blame. He argues that the real issue is the Seklo mine, the family's weather-independent source of revenue, which Mido had taken control of. Mido, the younger brother of the previous head of the family, responds arrogantly. He had avoided military service by claiming to have a weak body and now lives off the Leonius family's support. He questions why a commoner like Lota thinks he has the authority to challenge him. Lota falls silent, while Sigma tells him to step back. From behind the door, Alpha recognizes Mido and remembers that he is essentially a parasite who never fought in the war. Mito accuses Sigma of neglecting the territory and allowing even a chamberlain to disrespect him. Sigma admits that he has no words to defend himself. Alpha becomes irritated by Mito's behavior. Sigma acknowledges that the territory is suffering because of the cold weather, making it difficult to provide the capital Mito is requesting. Mito dismisses the problem, arguing that Sigma should simply collect taxes as usual, even if the harvest is poor. Sigma refuses, explaining that doing so would leave the residents starving. Mito argues that those who cannot pay should simply die, while Sigma points out that losing residents would also reduce tax revenue. Alpha becomes increasingly frustrated, thinking that someone who has never managed a territory has no right to lecture Sigma. Mito then returns to his main proposal. He claims that a certain project is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and promises that, if Sigma provides the capital, it will generate several times the investment. He suggests using the profits to provide charity to the residents. When Sigma remains silent, Mito offers to lend him the money himself. He says they only need to prepare a formal contract. Alpha immediately becomes suspicious. Lota objects, pointing out that Mito's own wealth originally came from the Leonius household and questioning why they would need a loan from within the same family. Mito becomes furious at Lota's insolence. Although Lota apologizes, Mito insists that a commoner has no place interfering in a conversation between nobles. He then orders Sigma to cut Lota down. Mito further threatens Sigma, claiming that refusing would be an insult not only to him as his uncle, but also to Sigma's late father. He refuses to forgive what he considers their disrespect. Alpha realizes the situation is becoming dangerous because nobles are unlikely to take back such direct orders. Sigma exhales coldly and addresses his uncle. Instead of attacking Lota, Sigma bows and accepts Mito's offer of a loan, apologizing for his servant's insolence. Lota is shocked. Mito is pleased and produces a prepared contract for 2,000 gold coins, claiming that he only wants to help the young head of the family. Lota realizes that 2,000 gold coins is equivalent to the annual output of the Siklo mine. With that amount, the territory could have survived the previous year's crop failure. Mito explains that the proposed import business is backed by Count Astaroth of the Kingdom of Melia and claims its success is guaranteed. The territory will be used as collateral, but he insists there is nothing to worry about before telling Sigma to sign. Alpha immediately recognizes the phrase guaranteed profit as one commonly used in scams. He realizes that this may be the very reason Sigma will eventually hand his title and territory over to his uncle because of financial difficulties. The debt could be the cause. Sigma sits down, prepares the ink, and takes the pen. Mito laughs as he claims that the investment will secure the Leonius territory's finances for the next 10 years. Sigma places the pen on the contract and prepares to sign. Alpha suddenly enters the room and objects, arguing that an investment is still a gamble and that there is no such thing as a guaranteed outcome. Mito angrily demands to know who Alpha is, while Sigma looks at him in surprise. Alpha steps forward, then realizes that interfering may only put his master at an even greater disadvantage. Suddenly, a blue screen appears in front of him. Alpha stares at it in shock as the bet chip system displays a gambling mission. Confused by the sudden notification, Alpha looks at the screen and wonders what exactly he is supposed to bet. The system asks Alpha what he is willing to bet. Alpha is confused and assumes the system must be connected to his past life as a gambler. He considers whether it is asking him to bet a body part. Betting his head could mean being beheaded by the Margrave, while betting something else could leave him at the mercy of that useless noble. By elimination, he settles on his left arm, though losing it would make life far more difficult. After thinking it over, Alpha confidently chooses his left arm. The system accepts the bet, and several blue chains suddenly appear and grip Alpha's right hand. The bet chip system then displays a gambling mission: void the loan contract. Alpha realizes that he only needs to sabotage the loan by whatever means necessary. Since this is a gamble, he believes he has a chance to win. Lord Mito demands that Sigma take responsibility for Alpha's repeated insolence and asks how the servant will be punished. Sigma offers his IOU as an alternative, but Mito insists on punishing Alpha. Alpha immediately runs over, bows deeply, and apologizes. He explains that he never intended to insult Mito and only spoke because his master is too inexperienced with worldly matters. He then begins praising Mito's business sense, saying that investments naturally involve risks, but Mito has managed to reduce those risks while increasing the potential return. Mito is pleased to hear that a commoner understands investments. Alpha goes further, explaining that while a 30% success rate would already be considered excellent, Mito's plan appears to have a 50-50 or even 60 to 70% chance of succeeding. Mito corrects him, confidently claiming the chances are closer to 8 or 9 out of 10. Alpha reacts with exaggerated admiration, calling Mito a financial genius and practically a god. Mito begins to feel that he has finally found someone who genuinely supports him, since the people of the territory have always kept their distance. Alpha then points out that Sigma does not understand the risks. Even an 8 or 9 out of 10 success rate still leaves a 10 to 20% chance of failure. If Sigma does not understand that before signing he may later complain that the outcome was different from what he expected, reject the contract, or even try to eliminate Mito by force. Alpha quietly reminds Mito that Sigma is essentially just a swordsman who knows little about such matters. Mito realizes that Alpha has a point. Alpha then offers to demonstrate exactly what an 8 or 9 out of 10 chance means by betting his left arm. Sigma and Lota are shocked by the proposal. Alpha places his red boxes on the table and explains a simple fortune-telling game. A copper coin is placed inside one box, and normally only one of 3 boxes is the winner. However, this time 4 out of 5 boxes will be winners, matching Mito's claimed 80% success rate. Only one box is a loser. Alpha explains that the chance of drawing a winning box is 4 out of 5, or 80%, but there is still a possibility of choosing the loser. The chance of losing twice is 1/5 multiplied by 1/5, or 1 in 25. Therefore, the chance of winning at least once over 2 attempts is 24 out of 25, or 96%. Alpha presents it as less of a fortune-telling game and more of a good luck charm that commoners use to boost morale because it is almost impossible to lose. Mito dismisses the game as trivial but is secretly impressed that Alpha calculated the complicated odds so quickly. Mito then asks what Alpha meant by betting his left arm. Alpha explains that if Mito draws a winning box, he will offer his left arm as compensation for his earlier rudeness and allow it to be cut off. Mito finds the proposal interesting. Simply firing Alpha would accomplish nothing, but taking his arm would serve as an example to the commoners and make them fear and respect him. Alpha is shocked to realize that this is what the system meant by betting his head or other body parts. Mito asks Sigma if he has any objections. Sigma draws his sword and calmly agrees, stating that since Alpha proposed the wager himself, he has no objection to severing the arm immediately if necessary. Alpha is horrified by his own decision and privately regrets choosing such a dangerous option. He then gives a nervous smile and asks Mito to show mercy if he somehow manages to draw the losing box twice. Mito agrees. Alpha places all the boxes on the table and begins the game. He rapidly switches the boxes while Lota watches closely and realizes that Alpha has secretly switched their positions. Alpha finishes and invites Mito to choose any box. Mito remains confident, recalling that even his late brother used to acknowledge his superior luck when drawing lots. Alpha privately finds it ironic that luck seems to be the only thing Mito could ever claim to have beaten his brother in. Mito selects a box and opens it. It is empty. Alpha points out that Mito's supposed 8 or 9 out of 10 odds have already failed. Mito immediately demands another attempt. Alpha presents the losing box and begins the second round, again switching the boxes rapidly. Lota watches closely and realizes that Alpha has switched them once more, wondering whether Mito has failed to notice. Alpha places the boxes back into position and asks Mito to choose. Mito carefully analyzes Alpha's movements. He notices an unnatural movement from Alpha's right hand and believes the losing box is second from the right. However, the boxes on either side also seem suspicious, so he decides to avoid them. Instead, he chooses the far left box, where the losing box had originally been placed. Alpha tells him to open it. Mito lifts the box, but his fingers begin to tremble. The box is empty. Mito is stunned, drops the box, and cannot believe what happened. Alpha points out that even a 96% chance is not the same as certainty. Mito remains pale and shocked. Lota exhales in relief and realizes that Alpha's arm has been spared. He also hopes this momentum will help resolve the loan situation. Suddenly, Mito demands one more attempt. Lota is shocked. Mito argues that the first attempt should not count because he chose randomly. Since Alpha called the game a good luck charm, Mito claims that ending the matter after such a bad omen would leave a bad feeling surrounding the investment. He insists that he will draw the winning box next time, after which they can proceed with the contract. Alpha lowers his head, remaining suspicious of Mito's sudden insistence. Lord Sigma crosses his arms and silently observes everything. Lord Mito narrows his eyes and points out that Alpha's left arm is still on the table. Alpha places both hands on the table, gathers his courage, and agrees to begin the third round. He holds up the 5 boxes, revealing that 4 are winners and 1 is the loser. After showing the empty losing box, Alpha begins switching the boxes at incredible speed. Mito watches closely and realizes that he has misunderstood the game. This is not simply about drawing a winning box, it is a psychological game designed to make him choose the loser. In the first round, Alpha placed the loser in the easiest position to reach, closest to Mito's right hand. That was the biggest gamble because if Mito had leaned forward and chosen another box, Alpha's plan would have failed. The result of the first round then influenced the second. Since Mito had already drawn the loser from the far right position, he became cautious. Alpha exploited that caution by making it appear that the loser had been moved to the second position from the right. Alpha also repeatedly starting with the loser on the far left had narrowed Mito's choices. Even though Mito believed he was making his own decisions, Alpha had been guiding him toward the far left box. Alpha finishes switching the boxes and invites Mito to choose. Mito studies them carefully. The middle box appears suspicious, but he decides to ignore it. The far left and far right boxes are also difficult to trust because of the previous rounds, leaving the second and fourth boxes. However, he suspects that choosing either one may be exactly what Alpha wants. Mito becomes increasingly frustrated, feeling that every possible choice is another trap. Then he gets an idea and calls on Sigma, asking where he believes the losing box is. Loda and Alpha are shocked by the request. Loda objects, but Mito argues that there is nothing wrong with asking Sigma for help in protecting the investment. Sigma remains silent for a moment before closing his eyes and identifying the fourth box from the right as the loser. Lota is shocked. Mito gives a confident smile, claiming that he knew it. He says the fourth box left the weakest impression during the previous rounds and that he had been about to choose it anyway. Instead, Mito selects the middle box and praises Alpha's trick, believing that the boy will now pay for deceiving him with his left arm. He opens the box. It is empty. Alpha quietly laughs and encourages him to open another. Mito chooses another box and opens it, but that one is empty as well. The box slips from his hand as he becomes unable to understand why he keeps losing. Alpha points out that the probability of drawing the loser 3 times in a row is only 1 in 125. He remarks that this is far worse than Mito's claimed 8 or 9 out of 10 odds, and jokingly suggests that Mito has suffered an extraordinary streak of bad luck. Alpha adds that it could even be considered an ill omen for Mito and his investment. Mito stares at his trembling fingers, unable to understand why his hand keeps choosing the losing boxes. Sigma watches with a faint smile before standing. He apologizes to his uncle but decides to cancel the investment deal. Mito protests, insisting that Sigma cannot back out now. Sigma explains that they cannot proceed without the blessing of the gods, and that he nearly made a careless decision by neglecting his responsibility to protect the livelihoods of his people. Mito is left speechless, insisting that the decision is unfair. He then leaves the room. Alpha begins collecting his boxes, and Loda asks where he learned such sleight of hand capable of deceiving even Sigma. Alpha admits that Sigma and Mito were completely right. It was a cheat. Sigma realizes that the game was rigged after all. Alpha explains that only one of the 5 boxes actually contained a copper coin. Loda is shocked because he clearly heard sounds coming from the other boxes as well. Alpha reveals his trick. While holding an empty box, he had secretly shaken his left hand to create the sound of a coin rattling. Loda is amazed. Alpha explains that the simplest tricks often become the biggest blind spots. By making Mito believe 4 out of 5 boxes were winners when there was actually only one, Alpha ensured that Mito would keep choosing incorrectly. Loda almost feels sorry for Mito, but Alpha points out that even with only a 1 in 5 chance, 3 attempts would still give Mito nearly a 50% chance of winning. It was not necessarily a bad bet. The key was making absolutely certain that Mito never selected the only winning box. Alpha explains that the first round was easy because he placed the winner on the far left, furthest from Mito. In the second round, he placed the winner on the far right, where Mito had failed to choose during the first round. For the third round, he again placed the winner on the far left, though this was a slightly riskier gamble. Loda remains amazed and again wonders where Alpha learned such tricks. He suddenly remembers Old Man Yogi's win earlier that afternoon. Alpha explains that he normally does not use such tricks, but when someone is suffering through an especially terrible losing streak, he does not mind helping. He also believes it is better not to leave grudges between friends. Loda recognizes how sly Alpha is and tells him to return to his quarters. Alpha agrees and starts leaving. As he reaches the door, Sigma calls his name. Alpha freezes and slowly turns around. Sigma thanks him for his assistance. Alpha gives a nervous smile before leaving the room and closing the door behind him. As he walks through the hall, Alpha reflects that he never expected to receive thanks from the so-called cold-blooded decapitator. He smiles genuinely, hoping that if his actions changed even a small part of Sigma's fate, then it was worth it. While walking, Alpha tosses one of the boxes. Suddenly, blue light spreads throughout the hallway. Alpha is startled when the box itself turns blue. A display appears before him and Alpha recognizes the system again. The bet chip system announces his first-time chip acquisition, 80 chips. Alpha remembers that he earned the chips by betting his arm and realizes that, despite being tricked into it, Everything worked out in the end. The system then explains its rules. Alpha can bet his initial chips on future gambling missions to increase his total. If his chips reach 0, the game ends with his death. The chips he earns can also be exchanged for rewards. Alpha realizes that he simply needs to increase his current 80 chips and wonders what kinds of rewards are available. The system displays the exchange rewards, including items, weapons, skills, knowledge, summons, titles, maps, magic, enhancements, item appraisal, status appraisal, swordsmanship, land appraisal, martial arts, weather appraisal, archery, spearmanship, and higher-level swordsmanship, along with several unknown rewards. Alpha studies the list with growing interest. His eyes widen as he realizes how useful the system could be. For the first time, Alpha feels that this new life might become genuinely interesting. The next morning, the estate's brutal routine begins again under the bright sun. Alpha drags a wagon loaded with hay, sweating heavily as exhaustion takes over his body. He immediately regrets staying awake all night exploring the bet chip system instead of sleeping. The system's options had been too fascinating to ignore. Before he realized it, the entire night had passed while he remained glued to the screen. Even after going to bed, his mind was still occupied by the possibilities of the chip exchange, leaving him unable to sleep. Back at work, Alpha sweeps the dusty yard while thinking about which skill he should spend his chips on first. His thoughts are interrupted when a coworker calls from the fence and tells him that the head butler wants to see him immediately. A few minutes later, Alpha enters the head butler's large office and waits for his new orders. He is surprised when the butler informs him that he has been promoted to the Count's personal attendant. The new position requires Alpha to stay with Lord Sigma throughout the day and remain available during the night. After processing the sudden change in his duties, Alpha accepts the responsibility. Looking down at his filthy work clothes, Alpha wonders if he is expected to serve the Lord dressed like that. The butler immediately orders him to change into a clean uniform. Later, the estate's training grounds are filled with activity. Alpha arrives at the outdoor practice area, where the knights are training with straw dummies and wooden weapons. Holding a wooden sword, Alpha stands in the dirt, confused about why he has been brought to a combat lesson. A female knight approaches and recognizes him as the master's new attendant. Seeing his confusion, she explains that he cannot simply follow the Lord around while leaving all the training to Sigma. Alpha protests that an attendant should only handle the master's daily affairs, but the knight ignores his complaints and tells him that he will receive proper fencing lessons and needs to take them seriously. During the training, the instructor corrects Alpha's stance, telling him to bring his feet closer and straighten his back. Alpha tries to keep up, but quickly realizes that he has almost no stamina. He soon begins panting heavily before collapsing against a stone wall, completely exhausted. His energy feels completely depleted. Looking at his hands, Alpha feels intense pain from repeatedly swinging the wooden weapons. His palms are covered in blisters, making him wonder if he will have to endure this kind of torture every day. Sitting at the edge of the training yard, Alpha curses his situation. His original plan was to leave the territory before the war began, but now he has been trapped by his new responsibilities. A loud crack suddenly echoes through the yard. Lord Sigma lands a flawless strike, breaking his opponent's guard. Unable to recover, the knight immediately gives up the fight. Sigma shows no sign of slowing down. He simply turns toward the next challenger and calls him into the ring. Watching from a distance, Alpha realizes that the Count intends to fight through an entire line of opponents without taking a break. Annoyed by Sigma's seemingly endless stamina, Alpha wonders what is wrong with someone who can become this obsessed with training. The scene then shifts to a carriage traveling along a dirt road under the afternoon sun. Inside, the butler explains to Alpha that his duties also include accompanying Lord Sigma during administrative work. Today, he intends to teach Alpha about the territory's political situation. Alpha immediately becomes suspicious of the old man's intentions. From a hill overlooking a farming village, they watch the residents quietly going about their daily lives. The butler explains that the severe cold front the previous year destroyed most of the territory's crops. The harvest produced less than half of what the farmers normally earned, leaving many residents without their usual income. As a result, countless families now struggle to afford even their daily meals. The crisis has also driven up the prices of basic necessities, and some desperate families have resorted to secretly selling their own children. Hearing this, Alpha lowers his head and falls silent. He reflects on how, whenever food becomes scarce, the weakest people are always the first to suffer. He knows from his previous life that selfish decisions made by adults often push children into the worst circumstances. The situation reminds him of abandoned children left in dark and forgotten places, forced to scrape together whatever food they can find just to survive another day. Some are eventually taken away by cruel people who exploit their helplessness. Those memories anger Alpha. leading him to realize that such cruel injustice remains the same regardless of the era or world. The butler notices that Alpha has suddenly gone completely silent as they continue their journey. The old man asks if something is wrong, but Alpha quickly brushes it off. Thinking through the situation, Alpha realizes that the territory's financial crisis makes sense if its income has fallen so drastically. However, the butler corrects him, explaining that the problem is not simply a 50% drop in income. He reveals that Lord Sigma completely waived taxes for the people affected by the crop failure. Alpha is stunned, calling the decision insane. The butler patiently explains that tax revenue is needed to pay the Empire's tribute and cover the enormous cost of maintaining the army stationed at the border. Because Sigma waived the taxes, the Leonius family is now close to bankruptcy. Sigma even spent his own savings to cover the territory's expenses for the year. Alpha struggles to understand why anyone would pay those costs personally, especially when the Empire would never simply forgive the resulting debt. Then he realizes the reason behind Sigma's decision. The butler recalls that Sigma considered the people of the territory his family and believed it was his duty to carry them through the difficult times. Alpha is left speechless by the thought. He finds it hard to believe that a powerful noble would genuinely put the welfare of ordinary people before his own interests. It is completely different from the ruthless world Alpha knew, where parents could abandon their own children as soon as circumstances became difficult. The butler places a hand on Alpha's shoulder and reminds him that they should continue serving their master with everything they have, because Sigma considers them part of his family as well. Touched by those words, Alpha turns away, unsure how to respond. As they continue walking, the word family remains in his thoughts, bringing him an unfamiliar sense of comfort. The moment is interrupted when the butler suddenly stops after noticing a commotion ahead. Further along the road, they encounter a large crowd of angry villagers gathered around a supply wagon. The butler pushes through the crowd to find out what is happening. The problem is a merchant who is taking advantage of the shortage to charge extremely high prices. He claims that the lack of supplies has caused inflation, while a villager angrily points out that the price of salt has risen far too much since the previous month. The wagon is filled with basic necessities that the villagers desperately need. Nearby, a young girl begs the merchant for a discount on medicine because her father is seriously ill. The merchant shows no sympathy and dismisses her request as an attempt to guilt-trip him. Unable to tolerate the situation, the butler confronts the merchant and recognizes him as a member of Lord Mito's guild. He accuses the merchant of imposing unreasonable markups despite the guild receiving exclusive trading rights, on the condition that it would not exploit the people. The merchant defends himself by claiming that transporting the goods from distant regions is difficult, and argues that calling him a scammer is unfair. He then mocks the butler, saying that if the count dislikes his prices so much, he should buy the supplies himself, assuming he still has any money left. The insult toward Sigma's finances immediately angers Alpha. The merchant ignores them, climbs onto his wagon, and declares that nobody is forcing the villagers to buy anything. The sick girl's pleas fail to stop him. With a cruel smile, the merchant announces that he will return in 5 days and tells the villagers to spend that time experiencing what life is like without supplies. As the wagon leaves, the butler clenches his fists in anger over the merchant's arrogance. Alpha then points out that Lord Mito is using profits from the Leonius family's own mine to fund these exploitative imports. The butler immediately scolds him for speaking so disrespectfully. Despite the warning, Alpha begins forming a plan. After considering the situation, he realizes that the biggest obstacle is the estate's lack of starting capital. That night, silence covers the massive frontier mansion. Inside a dark storage room, Alpha searches through a sack of miscellaneous items while preparing his next move. With a determined smile, he resolves to use his gambling tricks against the greedy merchant and the manipulative Mito. A few days later, the merchant's supply wagon returns through the village gates exactly as promised. Confident that the villagers have suffered enough from the shortage, he expects them to pay whatever price he demands. He even plans to raise the prices higher than before as punishment for their earlier refusal to buy. However, after parking his wagon in the village square, he immediately notices that something is wrong. Instead of rushing toward his supplies, the villagers are walking away. Desperate to attract customers, the merchant loudly advertises the valuable goods they have been waiting for. The villagers continue ignoring him and complain about the outrageous price he charged for oil during his previous visit. Still desperate to make a sale, the merchant approaches the young girl whose father is sick and pressures her to buy the medicine at an absurd price. He then looks at her in a predatory manner and suggests that a pretty girl like her could make quick money by working for him at night. Frightened by the harassment, the girl tries to back away when a mysterious voice suddenly calls out to the merchant, stopping him. The The sound of wheels rolling along the dirt road then draws everyone's attention. Someone in the crowd wonders who is arriving in such a luxurious carriage. Alpha appears on top of the carriage, enthusiastically waving at the villagers and immediately drawing their attention. The carriage stops in the middle of the village, and the curious locals gather around it. Butler Otis steps out carrying a packed box and apologizes for taking so long to deliver the supplies. The estate servants then begin distributing everything. The young girl receives enough medicine to treat her father for an entire month, while the other villagers receive large quantities of oil. The merchant watches in disbelief as the situation completely changes. The villagers soon celebrate as they receive salt, cotton fabric, and even high-quality drinks. Furious that his business is being ruined, the merchant confronts Alpha and demands to know what he is doing. He angrily questions why the estate is giving expensive goods to the villagers for free. Relaxing on top of the carriage, Alpha calmly explains that they obtained the supplies themselves and sarcastically asks if the merchant has a problem with that. The merchant demands to know where they got the money, pointing out that everyone knows the Count's estate is practically bankrupt. Alpha responds with a mocking expression, clearly confident in his plan. 5 days earlier, Alpha had been struggling to find the starting capital they desperately needed. Since the main house had no money and asking Lord Mito was obviously impossible, he decided this was the perfect opportunity to test his new abilities. He activated the bet chip system, and blue light immediately filled the dark room as the interface appeared before him. After carefully examining the available options, Alpha purchased the item Appraisal Skill. The system explained that by focusing on an object for several seconds, he could reveal its hidden properties and actual value. Alpha immediately realized that the estate belonged to a powerful noble family, so searching its storage rooms might uncover forgotten valuables. He spent hours searching through the storage areas, but found nothing useful. Exhausted and frustrated, he eventually gave up and walked through the empty halls. He realizes it was naive to expect the servants to leave valuable jewelry or artwork lying around unnoticed. But he continues searching with the appraisal skill active. Even the mansion's furnishings seem surprisingly cheap for a high-ranking noble. After finding nothing of value, Alpha eventually wanders into an old shed filled with farming tools and basic supplies. Looking at the piles of junk, he assumes there is no chance of finding anything valuable. Then something hanging on a wooden wall catches his attention. Alpha focuses on it with his appraisal skill and discovers that the filthy animal pelt is actually durable magical boar leather worth 30 gold coins. His eyes widen in disbelief as he realizes that the worthless-looking hide is actually worth a small fortune. Excited, Alpha begins searching the shed at full speed. Soon, dozens of appraisal results appear before him, revealing that the entire shed is filled with valuable materials from high-level monsters. Alpha quickly understands their potential. Parts from powerful creatures can sell for enormous amounts of money. In the Leonius territory, however, hunting dangerous beasts is simply part of everyday life. The villagers eat the meat, while the remaining parts are usually discarded because they are too difficult to process. They use the tougher hides for basic winter clothing and the massive bones for farming tools, completely unaware of their true value. Meanwhile, wealthy nobles in the Empire's capital, far from the dangerous territories where these monsters live, are willing to pay enormous sums for rare materials from powerful creatures. With this discovery, Alpha immediately approaches the head butler and persuades him to obtain an official recommendation letter signed by Lord Sigma himself. With the recommendation letter secured, Alpha and a companion set off on an all-night journey in the estate's carriage, pushing it as fast as possible toward the city. Exhausted from the preparations, Alpha eventually falls asleep in the back while his companion maintains their pace. When they reach the city, the monster materials sell quickly to wealthy merchants, earning them a substantial amount of money. Back in the village square, the merchant demands to know where Alpha suddenly obtained the funds. Alpha simply calls it a trade secret and mocks him for expecting the source to be revealed. The merchant begins to panic as he watches his monopoly collapse. Alpha then announces that, from now on, all imports into the territory will be handled exclusively by the Ida Trading Company. The butler is embarrassed to hear the company named after him. The merchant desperately blocks the carriage, asking what he is supposed to do with his unsold supplies. Alpha coldly reminds him that he was the one who refused to sell them earlier. The merchant breaks down, worrying about his ruined business and how he will explain the losses to Lord Mito. Alpha's expression immediately turns serious. He warns the merchant to stop pretending to be a victim and confronts him over his actions. Alpha explains that a business can survive in the long term only by taking care of its customers. The villagers were not trying to exploit anyone. They were already cutting back on their meals and making sacrifices simply to survive the crisis. He then accuses the merchant of building his entire business around exploiting desperate people and calls his actions nothing more than extortion. Alpha angrily tells him never to associate such behavior with the title of a trading company again. Humiliated and afraid of the furious crowd, the merchant quickly backs away and flees. With the situation settled, the carriage continues down the road. Alpha casually mentions that even after selling the monster materials and supplying the village, they are still making a substantial profit. The villagers sincerely thank the butler for helping them, but Alpha stops the emotional moment by explaining that the new company will charge a strict 20% fee on every transaction. Satisfied with his plan, which combines helping the villagers with maintaining a sustainable profit, Alpha considers the operation a complete success. Later, inside the castle office, the butler reports everything to Lord Sigma. He explains how impressed he is by Alpha's natural ability, and admits that he is beginning to wonder what kind of person the young attendant really is. As night settles over the estate, the butler finishes his report, emphasizing that the village's supply crisis was resolved entirely because of Alpha's bold actions. Sigma quietly listens while continuing to work through the documents on his desk. He briefly imagines his uncle Mito throwing a fit over the lost profits, but dismisses the thought, deciding that Mito brought it upon himself by attempting to exploit the farmers. Sigma praises his subordinate for his work and dismisses him for the night. The butler bows deeply and heads toward the office doors, but stops before leaving. He looks back and asks whether Sigma had already predicted that Alpha would achieve all of this when he appointed him as his personal attendant. The question makes Sigma pause and look up from his reading. With his usual calm expression, Sigma explains that he is not capable of predicting the future with such precision. The butler immediately apologizes for being presumptuous. Sigma then admits that deep down he expected someone with Alpha's level of nerve would not simply stand by and watch an injustice take place. The butler is amazed to hear the nation's hero speak so highly of an ordinary commoner. Outside, the moon shines over the castle towers as the peaceful night settles over the estate. Back in his room, Alpha wakes up and stretches, already complaining that his new duties are probably going to work him to exhaustion. The next scene shifts to the territory's mountains and forests under the daylight. Among the trees, a ripe red apple catches Alpha's attention. He quickly reaches out and plucks it from the branch before climbing higher into the tree. Taking a bite, Alpha complains about his current situation and laments that there is absolutely nothing interesting to do in this remote place. The sweet taste catches Alpha off guard, and he admits that the apple is actually pretty good. His mood settles as he realizes that the money earned from the monster materials has solved the estate's immediate problems, but it is nowhere near enough to fix the family's long-term financial crisis. Alpha becomes serious as he considers what will happen if he does nothing. Eventually, Lord Mito could take control of everything. Determined to prevent that outcome, Alpha decides he must find a way to change his master's tragic fate before the estate falls apart. He remembers spending the entire previous night studying the bet chip system and checks his remaining balance. He still has 75 chips, so he decides to keep 50 in reserve for future bets. Looking through the available skills, Alpha finds what he believes could be the perfect solution. He spends 15 chips on the terrain appraisal skill. With renewed confidence, Alpha begins exploring the mountains, imagining that discovering a gold mine or valuable gems could completely solve the family's financial problems. He even thinks that finding a silver mine would not be too much to ask. For the next several hours, Alpha searches every part of the mountain, climbing rocks and swinging across vines in hopes of finding something valuable. However, the untouched wilderness offers him nothing but small bird nests hidden among the leaves. Completely exhausted, Alpha drags himself through the dirt and eventually collapses to rest. He regrets wasting his hard-earned chips on the terrain appraisal skill and the other useless options he had purchased. Then, a strange sound catches his attention. Looking down from a branch, Alpha sees a nun trapped against a rocky cliff by a massive three-eyed wolf. The beast growls as it prepares to attack. With nowhere left to escape, the terrified woman clutches a gold amulet and desperately prays to her god for a miracle. The wolf suddenly lunges, its jaws open wide, revealing sharp fangs as it prepares to bite. The nun shuts her eyes and screams for help. At the last moment, Alpha drops from the trees and smashes the wolf's head with a heavy branch. The impact knocks the beast backward with a painful cry. The nun slowly opens her eyes, confused that she is still alive, while Alpha lands in the dirt and raises the branch defensively between her and the wolf. The creature bares its fangs, furious that its attack was interrupted. Alpha grips his makeshift weapon and warns the beast not to underestimate humans. Knowing a physical attack alone will not be enough, he focuses his energy into his left hand. The magic system activates a basic wind spell, creating a small tornado around his fingers. The sudden gust strikes the wolf and forces it backward under the pressure of the magic. Realizing that the prey will not be easy to kill, The beast retreats down the path it came from. The area becomes quiet again. Relieved that the wolf has finally given up, Alpha rests the branch on his shoulder. He is glad he purchased the wind skill, even though he knows the weak spell probably would not have defeated the monster if it had continued fighting. He then turns to the nun and asks if she was injured. Instead of answering him, the nun clasps her hands together and happily thanks her god for saving her. Alpha stands there awkwardly, realizing she has completely ignored the person who actually rescued her. He points toward himself and makes it clear that he was the one who saved her, not some invisible deity. Giving up on arguing with her devotion, Alpha asks why she was traveling alone through such dangerous mountains. The nun dramatically points toward the sky and declares that she is never alone because her god is always with her. Alpha covers his face, realizing that having a normal conversation with her may be impossible. The woman suddenly drops the act and complains about Alpha judging her. She admits that the holy persona was fake. With a bright aura around her, she explains that the image of a pure and flawless nun is exactly what wealthy believers in the capital love. Alpha is stunned by her shamelessness and accuses her of regional discrimination. He points out that divine love should treat everyone equally, regardless of where they live. The woman simply shrugs and winks, completely abandoning the holy image she had been portraying moments earlier. The absurd exchange breaks the tension, and the two begin laughing together in the quiet forest. Afterward, the nun becomes sincere and properly thanks Alpha for saving her. She finally introduces herself as Theta. Alpha smiles and introduces himself, relieved that Theta is safe. The peaceful moment is interrupted when Theta notices blood on his arm. She grabs it and realizes he is injured. Alpha dismisses it as a minor scratch from a tree branch, but Theta refuses to ignore an injury to the person who just saved her. She channels her spiritual energy and casts a healing spell, surrounding Alpha's hand with a warm glow. Alpha watches in amazement as the deep cut closes completely within seconds, leaving no scar. Impressed by the power of the magic, Alpha realizes how incredible healing spells can be. Exhausted from using the spell, Theta clasps her hands together and asks Alpha to keep her ability a secret. Confused by her request, Alpha questions why she would want to hide such a powerful gift. But before he can get an answer, several armored knights and an older cleric emerge from behind the trees and call out to Theta with relief. Later that afternoon, the group arrives at the gates of the Leonius estate. Inside the guest room, Lord Sigma formally welcomes the visitors. He asks whether they are returning from a pilgrimage to the mountains and remarks that it is unusual for an archbishop from the capital to personally accompany such a journey. The archbishop politely explains that visiting the Holy Land is a mandatory duty for members of the main temple. The older cleric then reveals that he has known Theta since she was a child, and that her pilgrimage inspired him to visit the sacred site himself for the first time in 10 years. Sigma praises their devotion and mentions that perhaps he should someday travel to the capital to meet the emperor, although he feels somewhat out of place as a warrior among political figures. Alpha listens and remembers that the great mountain in the region is considered a sacred stairway to heaven, where the supreme god is said to have descended. The archbishop then explains that he initially thought bringing 5 armed knights to escort an old cleric and a young woman was excessive. However, their journey quickly proved otherwise when they were attacked by a pack of magical beasts. The archbishop admits that he came dangerously close to losing his adopted daughter during the attack. He explains that it was their first encounter with magic beasts, and because they had no experience dealing with them, several managed to break through their defenses. The archbishop sincerely thanks Alpha for saving Theta, and Alpha respectfully bows, saying he was honored to help. Watching from the back, head butler Loda points out that protecting an archbishop should normally be the responsibility of the temple knights. He then examines the crest on the guard's armor and recognizes it as belonging to the Imperial Knights. The unusual combination of forces makes Loda suspicious. He begins wondering whether the group's real purpose is to investigate the Count's territory under the guise of escorting the pilgrimage. The archbishop quickly changes the subject and praises the border troops for constantly protecting civilization from monsters. Theta enthusiastically supports him, explaining that the region's sacred peak is a dream destination for believers who wanted to feel closer to their god. As Alpha listens, he begins thinking about a new scheme. Loda remarks that traveling through such dangerous mountains requires serious protection, and that ordinary mercenaries would be useless if a large group of beasts attack. The archbishop readily agrees and praises the elite knights trained by Sigma for successfully holding back the monster attacks. Growing tired of the small talk, Loda attempts to steer the discussion toward more important matters. Before he can, Alpha suddenly steps forward, rubbing his hands together and announcing that he has a small business proposal. Loda is stunned by Alpha's lack of restraint and immediately scolds him for interrupting an important meeting with high-ranking guests. Alpha ignores the reprimand and asks the Archbishop to give him just 1 minute. Lota quickly pulls him back and quietly tells him to stop making the guests uncomfortable. Alpha apologizes and promises that his proposal will benefit everyone. With confidence, he suggests using the resources of the Leonius territory to officially sponsor pilgrimage trips for believers from the capital. He explains that the new trading company already operates supply routes through the region, meaning those same routes could be used to safely transport interested pilgrims while providing proper protection against the magic beasts. The plan begins with small groups of 10 people, accompanied by night escorts as part of a premium paid service. Along with guaranteed security, the package would provide quality lodging and generous meals, creating a complete VIP pilgrimage experience. Alpha enthusiastically presents the idea as a completely safe tour to the sacred border peak. The Archbishop is impressed, admitting that such a service is exactly what the Church has always wanted, though he questions whether something so complicated can actually be organized. The Imperial Knights continue watching Alpha suspiciously, while Theta clasps her hands together with renewed hope. Lota looks toward Sigma, waiting for his decision. After carefully considering the benefits and risks of turning his territory into a religious tourism destination, Sigma agrees that the plan is practical and could work. From a military standpoint, he explains that his knights can accompany the pilgrims under the justification of routine anti-monster patrols. With Sigma's approval, the Archbishop happily accepts the proposal. Oda immediately shifts into business mode and warns that such a luxurious package will come at a high price. The Archbishop readily agrees, considering it a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. As Alpha leaves, he begins planning how to involve Old Man Yogi and the others in preparing local food and souvenirs, creating additional sources of profit from the visitors. Pleased with his idea, Alpha privately celebrates the beginning of his border tourism business. Watching him leave, the Archbishop remarks to Theta that the people working at the estate are certainly an unusual group. Theta responds with a small laugh. Night falls over the castle, bringing an end to the long day of negotiations. At sunrise, the training yard is already filled with the sound of wooden swords striking against each other. Alpha charges at his instructor with everything he has, but the female knight easily blocks his attack and knocks his wooden sword aside. She criticizes the weakness of his strike and reminds him that a real battle requires lethal intent, since even a small opening can cost someone their life. Alpha accepts the lesson and continues practicing under the harsh morning sun, sweating heavily as he grips his training sword. Theta watches the sparring session from outside the ring, impressed by Alpha's determination. After several more rounds, the instructor finally ends the morning training. Completely exhausted, Alpha collapses against the wooden fence. Theta approaches with a quiet laugh and points out that although he complains constantly, he always gives his best during training. Alpha explains that he spent the previous night planning the pilgrimage business, but still believes it would be disrespectful to treat his training casually. His answer surprises Theta, who praises him for repeatedly exceeding her expectations. Her expression suddenly changes, however, and she becomes visibly depressed while comparing Alpha's determination with her own situation. Noticing the change, Alpha asks whether something happened during her journey to the territory. The two sit together on the grass, and Theta finally opens up. She reveals that she is officially a candidate to become the next Holy Maiden. The position is considered one of the most important in the world because the Holy Maiden is believed to receive direct messages from the Supreme God. According to the Empire's history, a person blessed with this ability appears only once every 100 years to guide humanity. Alpha realizes that the next century mark is approaching and is surprised that Theta has been chosen for such an important role. Theta, however, sighs and explains that the truth behind her selection is far less impressive. She claims she was chosen because her noble family possesses enormous political influence and wealth. Alpha is caught off guard upon learning that the seemingly ordinary nun comes from a powerful aristocratic family. Theta then recalls her childhood, explaining that her family considered her their greatest embarrassment and eventually abandoned her at the main temple because they believed she was useless. She spent her childhood hidden within the church, carrying the pain of being rejected by her own family. Returning to the present, Theta explains that the Archbishop always encouraged her, telling her that she could become the chosen one of her generation. Despite his faith in her, Theta admits that she never truly believed it herself. Because Theta is so stressed about her role, the old cleric sent her to the holy peak, hoping that getting closer to the heavens might awaken some divine sign. For countless nights, Theta knelt before the massive stone altars and desperately prayed for any response from her god. She begged for a sign that would prove she was not useless, but after endless attempts, she received nothing but silence. Feeling sorry for her, Alpha listens as Theta explains how she spent her entire life feeling unwanted. As a child, she believed dedicating herself to the church might finally make someone care about her. She even convinced herself that becoming the Holy Maiden would make her parents return to her. With tears in her eyes, Theta admits that all she ever wanted was a chance to change her life. Trying to hide her pain, she forces a smile and blames herself for getting carried away. She accepts that someone as useless as her was never meant to become the chosen one and begins giving up on the idea entirely. Alpha suddenly stands and angrily tells her to stop talking like that. Theta stares at him in confusion. Crouching to her level, Alpha explains that every person eventually faces a decisive moment that can determine the course of their entire life. He asks whether she has ever faced such a crossroads, and she nervously admits that she has. Alpha then recalls his former life at underground poker tables, where he faced dangerous mafia bosses in high-stakes games. With marked cards and enormous risks involved, winning meant wealth and fame, while losing could mean death. Holding his chips tightly, Alpha explains that no one can predict the future, but leaving everything to fate at the most important moment of your life is the worst excuse possible. According to Alpha, winning requires the determination to reach out and take control of your own destiny. He compares it to his old gambling days, where the cards seem to control everything, and tells Theta that she is the only person who can decide her future, not some distant god. Theta is stunned by how boldly he speaks about her faith. Alpha then criticizes her defeatist attitude, joking that any god who chose someone with such a mindset would have to be crazy. Since they are returning to the capital the next day, Alpha suggests visiting the mountain altar one final time. He encourages Theta to face the god directly, demand to be chosen with confidence, and do what she believes is her duty. His ridiculous logic makes Theta burst into genuine laughter. The two then walk through the fields together, and Theta asks what she should do if she loses this gamble with her life at stake. Alpha jokingly tells her to abandon everything and run away as fast as she can. Theta laughs and calls him a cheater. As they continue walking through the peaceful landscape, Theta realizes she had been so consumed by her own problems that she never truly possessed the determination required for the position. Looking toward the sky, she decides that what matters most is helping the world, whether or not she receives the title of Holy Maiden. Taking in the mountain scenery, Theta feels grateful for the divine grace that allowed her to visit the territory. Suddenly, a mysterious beam of light descends from the sky. A radiant glow surrounds Theta as a heavenly voice calls her the child of compassion and delivers a prophecy about someone who will bring harmony to the world. The prophecy declares that this destiny has already been decided. Alpha rushes toward Theta, startled by the sudden light. Theta remains frozen, struggling to understand whether she has truly received a divine revelation. When Alpha reaches her, he asks if she is all right, but she remains speechless, still processing the message she has received. Alpha stares at her as the prophecy continues to echo, revealing the name of the chosen one. The scene then shifts back to the massive Leonius estate under the afternoon sun. Inside the guest room, the Archbishop speaks with the territory's nobles, keeping the meeting cordial and positive. Theta sits quietly on one of the sofas, listening to the conversation while keeping a low profile. Nearby, Count Sigma listens in silence, maintaining his usual serious expression. Soon, Alpha enters the hall, but before he can get far, Uncle Mito and his son burst in, loudly celebrating the arrival of the main temple's leader. Mito proudly declares that nothing happens in the territory without his knowledge. Alpha greets him with a friendly smile, which immediately makes the old man nervous. After Alpha sarcastically bows and welcomes him, Mito backs away in panic, calling him the god of bad luck. Alpha laughs at his reaction and tells him not to take it so seriously. Privately, he finds it amusing that even in this life, people somehow give him the same nickname despite knowing nothing about his past. Mito, however, remains convinced that Alpha is trouble. Sigma finally interrupts and asks his uncle what all the shouting is about. While the Archbishop and Theta watch, Mito ignores Sigma and approaches the cleric, introducing himself as the Count's uncle and welcoming him to the territory. The Archbishop politely asks him to drop the formalities. Mito then boasts about his generous donations to the temple and claims to be the region's most devoted believer. He even asks the Archbishop to arrange a meeting with the Pope, offering a personal payment in return. He goes as far as trying to place a bag of gold coins in the Archbishop's hands, but the cleric immediately refuses the bribe. Alpha is stunned by Mito's nerve. Sigma loses patience and orders his uncle to stop embarrassing himself. Mito is startled to realize that Sigma has been standing there the entire time, leaving Alpha frustrated by how slow he is to notice things. Suddenly, Mito's son loudly calls out to the Archbishop and introduces himself as Arrow with exaggerated confidence. The Archbishop remarks on his volume, while Theta quietly agrees. Mito proudly praises his son as a prodigy in both martial arts and academics. Everyone is visibly embarrassed by his boasting, while Alpha struggles to hide his discomfort. Mito further claims that Arrow's swordsmanship is second only to Sigma's, who is considered the strongest warrior in the Empire. Sigma lowers his head in frustration as the cleric continues politely listening. Loda quietly explains to Alpha that people rarely challenge these spoiled relatives seriously, because they want to avoid creating problems with the family. Alpha is stunned by their arrogance and delusion. Sigma attempts to bring the meeting back to its proper purpose. Meanwhile, Alpha quietly tells Theta that he needs to return to the holy altar and wonders whether he should simply slip away from the chaos. Theta calmly tells him there is no longer any need to worry about that. With a grateful smile, she thanks Alpha for everything he has done for her. Alpha becomes slightly flustered by her sincerity but agrees to let the matter go. Arrow notices Theta and asks who she is. The Archbishop introduces her as his companion during the pilgrimage and asks her to greet the guests. Theta politely introduces herself and offers the nobles her divine blessings. The moment Arrow hears her words, he becomes infatuated with her. He rushes forward, grabs her hands, and declares that he accepts her feelings, leaving Theta completely confused. Mito laughs at the scene while the Archbishop panics and orders Arrow to release the holy servant. Instead, Mito grabs Theta by the shoulders and begins promoting his son, boasting about Arrow's bright future. He then openly declares that Arrow will eventually become the next lord of the territory, after first joining the Temple Knights. The shocking statement leaves everyone stunned and furious. Alpha immediately realizes that Mito has just revealed his intention to take control of the family. Theta looks frightened and uncomfortable as Mito continues holding her. Unable to watch any longer, Alpha steps forward with a cold expression and physically blocks Mito's path. The old man immediately recoils under Alpha's intimidating stare before quickly regaining his confidence and beginning to shout. Mito argues that because Sigma has no children, Arrow would naturally inherit the title if Sigma were to die on the battlefield. To prevent the situation from escalating further, Sigma simply nods. Mito then gives a cynical laugh and claims that he never intended to disrespect the visitors from the capital. He apologizes to the Archbishop, pretending that he only became carried away while recommending his son for the elite Temple Knights. The Archbishop calmly explains that they did not bring that particular military unit with them on the pilgrimage. Confused, Mito asks who the armed guards actually are. The commander steps forward and explains that, because of a change in schedule, they are officially members of the Royal Knights. Mito is stunned. Sigma immediately realizes how much influence the Archbishop must have and suspects he has a close connection to the imperial family. Instead of being discouraged, Mito takes the revelation as another opportunity to promote his son. He claims their presence must be a divine sign and grabs both the Archbishop and the captain, insisting that their approval alone should be enough to get Arrow accepted. The two visitors are left visibly uncomfortable as Arrow joins in, striking an exaggerated heroic pose and demanding praise for his supposed bravery. Alpha watches the ridiculous display, clenching his fists as he realizes that Mito and Arrow have completely abandoned common sense. At that moment, the familiar bet chip system activates. Blue light surrounds Alpha as the holographic interface appears and presents a new betting mission: defeat Arrow, with several possible methods and different reward multipliers. The choices include a dice game, a marathon, and a sword duel. Alpha considers the options. The dice game would guarantee an easy victory, but the reward is far too small. He then considers the endurance challenge and begins calculating whether it would be the better choice. Suddenly, he gets an idea. Alpha raises a finger and quietly steps forward, positioning himself directly behind Sigma. Sigma confronts Mito and warns him that making such unreasonable demands of their guests is unacceptable. Mito ignores the warning and continues insisting that his plan is perfect. Then he notices Alpha beside him. Alpha suddenly suggests that Arrow simply take the entrance exam immediately, right there. Mito is startled and immediately panics, begging the so-called god of bad luck to stay away from him. Later that afternoon, the estate's training grounds are prepared for the unusual event. Cavalry members and estate workers gather around the dirt arena, forming a large circle around the field while the officers from the capital prepare the examination. The commander steps forward and explains the rules before officially announcing the start of the Royal Knights entrance exam. From the shaded viewing area, Sigma and the Archbishop watch the trial. Arrow stands in the center of the arena with a wooden sword in both hands. To pass, he must defeat 3 opponents consecutively. The commander calls for the first challenger. Alpha walks into the arena carrying his practice sword, appearing surprisingly calm. The Imperial officers watch him closely, curious to see what an ordinary attendant can actually do in combat. Lota, however, is confused by Alpha's sudden confidence and wonders where he found the courage to volunteer for such a fight. Alpha remains focused on his opponent, confident that he has already worked out the situation. Earlier, he had persuaded the Archbishop to allow him to go first. Since the examination was only a formality, the Archbishop agreed. Lota feels uncomfortable seeing Alpha dragged into the family's political conflict, but Alpha reassures him that everything depends on how Mito reacts. The butler then warns him that although Arrow may be spoiled, his fighting ability is no joke. Arrow has received proper military training and possesses a major physical advantage in close combat. The warning immediately shakes Alpha's confidence. He realizes that defeating a trained fighter after only a few days of sword practice will be extremely difficult. Looking at the system screen, Alpha panics as he realizes he has wagered all 20 chips on the hardest challenge. The massive multiplier blinds Alpha to common sense, and he immediately regrets not choosing the safer dice game. Since he already spent the rest of his chips on skills, losing this fight would leave him completely bankrupt in the system. Desperate for another option, Alpha asks whether the Imperial Knights could simply deal with Arrow afterward. Lota scolds him for disrespecting a noble's title. Alpha takes a breath and explains that he at least has a strategy. His plan is to exhaust Arrow as much as possible so the next opponents can finish him off. Sigma orders Alpha to be prepared for whatever happens after the match, and Alpha agrees. He then considers the danger posed by Mito and Arrow. If Arrow joins the Royal Knights, Mito's influence could grow enough to eventually take control of the entire territory. Determined to prevent that, Alpha resolves to eliminate the threat and protect Sigma's house from the pair. Back in the arena, the two fighters stand apart under the blazing sun, waiting for the signal. In the stands, Mito watches suspiciously, wondering why a mere attendant has been allowed to participate in an official examination. He quickly dismisses the concern, confident that Alpha cannot use any tricks in a straightforward fight. Mito also keeps a backup plan in mind in case his son somehow fails the physical test. In the arena, Arrow looks bored while holding his wooden sword. Although he considers Alpha a commoner, he decides he should at least pretend to take the fight seriously. Alpha digs his feet into the dirt, knowing that all his remaining chips are at stake and preparing to fight as hard as necessary. The commander raises his hand and gives the signal. The two immediately charge. Arrow rushes forward and swings his wooden sword down with tremendous force. Alpha's eyes widen at his speed and raises his weapon horizontally to block the attack. The impact shakes his arms under Arrow's overwhelming strength. Theta cries out in alarm when she sees Alpha struggling. The Imperial officers, however, quietly acknowledge the strength of his block as he fights to keep Arrow's weapon from crushing him. Alpha immediately understands the enormous difference in their physical abilities. Arrow continues with a series of powerful strikes, forcing Alpha backward. Alpha experiences firsthand what it means to face someone who has trained for combat his entire life. Unable to withstand the final attack, Alpha loses his balance and falls hard to the ground. He panics, realizing there is almost no chance to execute his original plan. Confident that he has already won, Arrow raises his sword to finish the fight. Then he notices Theta in the stands, clasping her hands and watching him with encouragement. Wanting to impress her, Arrow suddenly poses dramatically and calls for her to watch his skills. He then unleashes a rapid series of strikes against the grounded Alpha. Arrow becomes increasingly confident, imagining that defeating all three opponents will be effortless. Alpha struggles beneath the relentless attacks, while Arrow privately concludes that the commoner has no chance of fighting back. Already imagining his future victories, Arrow assumes that only the final opponent might give him any trouble. His thoughts become even more ridiculous as he imagines Theta as an angel blessing his battle. Convinced that her support makes defeat impossible, he loses himself in his fantasies. Alpha uses the opportunity to get back on his feet and reset his stance. He realizes that continuing to take a beating is ruining his reputation, so he decides to change tactics. Alpha calls out to Arrow and pretends to show respect, pointing out that the entire examination is happening because of him. He then deliberately lowers his guard and tells Arrow that he will have only one chance to land a perfect attack. The bait works. Arrow blushes, interpreting Alpha's move as an act of chivalry and becoming even more eager to impress Theta. Alpha raises his wooden sword and claims he will make the most of the opportunity. The two square off again in the center of the arena. Meanwhile, Arrow continues imagining his future in the Royal Knights, already convinced that he will soon surpass Sigma and rise to the rank of squad commander. Suddenly, Alpha charges forward. Their wooden swords meet in a direct clash, leaving Arrow confused by Alpha's sudden attack. The unfamiliar sword style makes it difficult for Arrow to anticipate the counter, despite his greater skill. With a confident expression, Alpha thanks him for lowering his guard and calls him a fool for falling into the trap. He immediately exploits the opening and activates his defense-breaking magic skill. With a precise strike, Alpha knocks Arrow's weapon straight upward. Up in the stands, the Archbishop and Theta watch the lightning-fast move in amazement, relieved to see Alpha gaining the upper hand. Arrow's guard is completely broken by the counter, while the Imperial commander closely studies the strange technique and orders his men to keep their eyes on Alpha. As Arrow sees the wooden sword coming toward his face, panic takes over. Alpha pours everything into one final attack, bringing his practice sword down with tremendous speed. The blow lands cleanly, leaving Arrow dizzy before his massive body crashes into the dirt, ending the first round of the exam. Mito screams in horror from the stands as the Imperial officer raises Alpha's hand and declares him the winner. The Archbishop and Theta celebrate, relieved that Alpha survived the fight. Alpha is equally relieved, grateful that the skill he spent all his chips on worked exactly as intended. The system confirms that the technique successfully shattered Arrow's stance and disarmed him. Furious over his son's defeat, Mito storms into the training area and demands to know why everyone is celebrating. He accuses Alpha of committing an unforgivable crime by injuring a member of the nobility. The commander calmly explains that injuries are expected during a physical sword examination, but Mito refuses to accept it. He argues that Alpha could have stopped once Arrow lost his guard but deliberately continued the attack. Pointing at Alpha, Mito demands that everyone witness what he calls an intentional assault. He claims the young attendant deliberately sabotaged his son's chance to join the Royal Knights and vows to make him pay. The estate workers watch nervously, fearing the situation is about to become a major disaster. Mito pushes the accusation further, claiming that a slightly different strike could have killed Arrow, and therefore amounted to an attempted murder. He then turns his anger toward Sigma, demanding to know whether the attack was ordered by the Count himself. Inwardly, Mito is pleased with the chaos, seeing it as the perfect opportunity to bring Sigma down. Sigma rises from his seat, his expression turning cold, while Mito demands that he take responsibility. A tense silence settles over the courtyard. The commander maintains that he has no objection to how the examination was conducted, forcing Mito to reluctantly acknowledge that point. Still refusing to back down, Mito shifts his argument, claiming the real issue is a subordinate attacking someone of higher status. Alpha lowers his head and repeatedly apologizes while Mito continues portraying himself and his son as victims. The nun and Archbishop remain silent as the situation grows more serious. Mito demands the harshest punishment allowed by law and then turns the accusation towards Sigma, arguing that refusing to punish his subordinate is effectively an act of rebellion against the Empire's class system. Seeking support, Mito looks toward the Archbishop. Caught in the political pressure, the Archbishop reluctantly agrees that the noble's argument has some basis under the law. Alpha immediately realizes how dangerous Mito's trap has become. Then Alpha makes his move. He steps toward Mito, takes full responsibility for the incident, and falls to his knees in the dirt, insisting that Sigma had nothing to do with the attack. His sudden submission shocks the other servants, while Theta and the Archbishop become genuinely worried about what might happen to him. Keeping his head lowered, Alpha offers to accept the punishment himself, but behind his submissive expression, he quietly smirks, knowing Mito is walking directly into the trap he has prepared. Mito angrily tells him to be quiet, declaring that the matter is no longer about a mere commoner. Alpha remains kneeling with his head buried in the dirt, waiting for his plan to reach its next step. Taking advantage of the VIPs present, Mito then announces an official petition to strip Sigma of his title as ruler of the border territory. Even as his title is challenged openly, the war hero remains completely expressionless. The Archbishop is deeply shocked by Mito's audacity to challenge the territory's highest authority, while the estate workers can only gulp nervously, fearing what will happen to their homeland. Acting as though he is simply seeking justice, Mito asks the Imperial officials to send his petition directly to the Imperial family for judgment. The commander agrees, stating that if the allegations are valid, they will be presented to the crown. Confident that his plan is working, Mito raises two fingers and begins listing Sigma's supposed failures. First, he accuses Sigma of losing control over his own staff, allowing rebellion and disorder to spread through the estate. His second accusation is even more serious: abandoning tax collection, which has supposedly created a financial crisis and prevented the territory from paying its obligations to the Emperor. Mito then demands that authority over the territory be transferred to him, claiming he is the only one capable of correcting these mistakes. Following Imperial procedure, the commander turns to Sigma and asks whether he has anything to say in his defense. Sigma calmly walks to the front of the stands with one hand resting on his sword. Without showing any attachment to his title, he states that if the crown decides he is unworthy, he will willingly surrender the territory. Alpha finally raises his head from the dirt, Stunned that his master could dismiss such a serious threat so easily, the estate workers panic at the thought of losing the leader who has protected them. The vice commander of the household forces quickly steps in and begs Sigma to reconsider, but Sigma remains firm. He explains that his true purpose is to serve the empire as its sword, regardless of whatever title he holds. Mito excitedly points out Sigma's statement to the archbishop, making sure the cleric understands that his nephew has essentially offered to give up his position voluntarily. An arrogant grin spreads across Mito's face as he celebrates what he sees as an easy victory. The archbishop can only sigh, believing the family's fate may already be decided. Meanwhile, Mito congratulates himself for manipulating the situation, convinced that in high society, the person who controls the blame controls the truth. He mocks the idea that Sigma's strength and reputation as a swordsman could overcome a carefully constructed political scheme. As Mito bursts into triumphant laughter, Alpha suddenly starts laughing just as loudly, throwing his head back without restraint. Mito immediately stops and stares at him in confusion, demanding to know what could possibly be so funny. The archbishop then brings the proceedings back on track by suggesting that they first determine whether Mito is actually qualified to take control of the territory. Oda steps forward and introduces himself, ready to present evidence. Mito looks at him in confusion, as the butler reveals that the mines placed under Mito's control generate enormous profits, yet his recorded tax payments are completely non-existent. Oda also questions the military achievements of Mito and his son, pointing out that both have repeatedly avoided military service through various excuses. Mito angrily tells the butler to stay in his place, but the archbishop calmly explains that they are only verifying the facts and asks him not to take the questions personally. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Oda produces the accounting records from Mito's exclusive trading company. The documents show that the merchant was selling essential goods at 3 times their normal price. Mito immediately panics and demands to know how Oda obtained such confidential records. The butler calmly explains that he simply requested the documents from the merchants under the archbishop's direct orders. Mito is left speechless, unable to form a defense. Then Oda presents an even more damaging piece of evidence: the promissory note Mito himself created to place Sigma under debt. Cold sweat runs down Mito's face as he realizes he forgot to retrieve the document after the betting incident. Desperate, he lunges for the paper, begging them to stop, but it is already too late. The archbishop examines the document and confirms that Mito was indeed behind the fraudulent scheme. He is even more disgusted when he notices a clause using the entire border territory as collateral for the loan. The archbishop turns to the knight commander and asks whether such a clause creates a serious legal violation. The commander confirms that attempting to use imperial territory as collateral is a major offense. As a direct consequence, the penalty for Mito's actions is the immediate loss of his noble status. The news destroys his ambitions, and he lets out an agonizing scream as everything he planned falls apart. The commander announces that he will forward Mito's petition, along with all the evidence against him, to the imperial family for judgment. Before the proceedings end, the archbishop raises one final point. He explains that after last year's disastrous harvest, many nobles requested tax reductions, yet the Leonius family continued paying the full amount. He then declares that Sigma is undoubtedly one of the emperor's most trusted subjects. The estate workers and soldiers erupt in cheers. Their celebration fills the training grounds as they show their deep respect for their lord. Sigma watches them quietly with his usual reserved expression. Meanwhile, Aro shakes his father, who remains collapsed on the ground, realizing that their entire plan has failed. Mito stays on his knees, completely drained and humiliated as he hears his name called. Alpha gives Aro a thumbs up with a wide grin, praising him for attempting such a risky comeback, even if it ultimately became a joke. Consumed by hatred, Mito points at Alpha and realizes that the so-called god of bad luck reputation was merely a setup to destroy him. Before the situation can escalate further, Aro picks up his defeated father and carries him away from the estate. Several days later, the imperial family issues an official order stripping Mito of his succession rights and returning full authority to the rightful count. He is also permanently prohibited from interfering in the affairs of the border territory. The betting system then congratulates Alpha for winning his wager and defeating Aro in the duel. Looking at the blue interface, Alpha celebrates receiving 80 chips as his reward. With Mito's scheme completely destroyed, peace returns to the Leonius territory. The next morning, everyone gathers in the castle courtyard for the church delegation's departure. The archbishop shakes Sigma's hand and expresses his hope of meeting him again in the capital. Escorted by the imperial knights, the cleric begins his journey home while the people of the estate respectfully see him off. Alpha then notices Theta still standing beside him. Confused, he asks why she did not leave with the others. Theta calmly explains that the archbishop gave her and her personal guard permission to remain at the estate for a while longer. Alpha wonders whether her extended stay is connected to some kind of spiritual training. Theta takes a serious stance and explains that she wants to personally witness how the prophecy she received on the mountain unfolds. Alpha simply smiles and wishes her luck on her journey. Back on the training grounds, the soldiers continue their intense physical drills. Aro raises his hand and loudly introduces himself, declaring that he has changed and intends to train like an ordinary soldier. The veterans find him unnecessarily loud, while the vice commander explains that with his privileges suspended, he will receive the same treatment as every other recruit. Spotting Alpha, Aro excitedly runs over and apologizes sincerely for everything that happened during the examination. He praises Alpha's impressive technique, making Alpha uncomfortable because he knows the victory came from the system's skill. Aro enthusiastically shakes his hand and says he looks forward to working with him. Alpha realizes that, despite everything, the young noble is actually a decent person. Determined to prove himself, Aro returns to training and begins practicing with his weapon. Alpha also continues his brutal fencing lessons, remembering that the territory's army is considered the strongest elite force in the Empire. Many of its soldiers survived the Gulf campaign alongside Sigma, while countless battles against powerful beasts helped forge them into an unmatched military force. Among these veterans, 3 commanders stand at an especially terrifying level of strength. Suddenly, one of them leaps forward and smashes the ground with a massive tree trunk. The impact shatters the soldiers' defenses and sends them flying. After clearing the entire front line alone, the giant complains that he needs more opponents to properly warm up. This overwhelming warrior is Ogun, the feared commander of the 1st Division. Side of the arena, a furious recruit charges at a blonde knight who looks completely relaxed. Without breaking a sweat, the veteran twirls his wooden weapon, causing the recruit's blade to slide harmlessly away. He immediately follows with a fast, unpredictable counter that disarms the soldier. Holding both swords, Commander Visconti smiles and praises the recruit for his effort. Watching from a distance, Alpha is stunned to see him perform the exact same technique he purchased through the system. Nearby, another training dummy is overwhelmed by a rapid barrage of strikes. The wooden frame is destroyed within seconds before the warrior finishes in a precise, agile stance. This speed-focused fighter is Claude, the vice commander responsible for leading the troops whenever the count is away. Watching the 3 commanders, Alpha realizes just how terrifying the territory's veterans are. Ogun and Visconti begin sparring while Claude carefully studies their movements. Claude suddenly dashes forward with a powerful vertical slash. Ogun blocks it with his massive log, but Visconti uses the opening to attack from behind. Claude twists around and parries the horizontal strike before quickly creating distance. The 3 commanders then exchange a rapid series of heavy blows. Claude maintains his defense while intercepting another strike from above, disrupting both opponents' rhythm. With incredible agility, he sweeps Ogun's legs while striking Visconti at the same time. Visconti braces himself as Claude leaps into the air and delivers a devastating downward strike. Their wooden weapons crack under the impact, forcing Visconti to struggle against the tremendous force while keeping his footing. After the intense exchange, the fighters finally pause, with Ogun lying defeated on the ground. Claude calls an end to the session, leaving Alpha convinced that if these commanders are already this powerful, Sigma must be the most terrifying warrior of them all. A month later, the sacred mountain shines beneath a clear blue sky as the first groups of pilgrims arrive along the border roads. Elderly visitors look around in awe as imperial knights guide them toward Uria Peak, turning the once quiet territory into a bustling destination. One soldier carrying a guide flag encourages the pilgrims through the final stretch, joking that nobody should collapse before reaching the summit. The Grandstone Temple is now crowded with visitors paying their respects, while an open-air market has been built along the streets to serve the growing number of travelers. Local merchants welcome the wealthy pilgrims, from colorful stalls selling grilled meat, fresh bread, and other food. Alpha walks through the busy market, checking on the results of his tourism project. He meets one of the workers and asks how business is going. Carrying a heavy load, the man happily thanks Alpha and confirms that sales are booming. Alpha notes that pilgrims return from the mountain hungry, naturally bringing plenty of customers to the food stalls. The porter agrees and adds that the small metal charms made by Old Yogi have also become extremely popular. Using leftover horseshoe metal from the estate's stables, the blacksmith had turned it into valuable souvenirs for the pilgrims to take home as reminders of their journey. Adjusting his heavy crate, the worker jokes that his only problem now is carrying so much merchandise up the mountain. Seeing the tourists enjoying their food, however, he says their happiness makes all the hard work worthwhile. Looking at how much the territory has changed, The man admits that the entire project has become a victory for everyone. He may not consider himself a business expert, but he agrees with Alpha that seeing the locals prosper feels genuinely rewarding. The worker pumps his fist as he heads off, celebrating the border's new golden era. Watching him leave, Alpha smiles peacefully, enjoying the gentle breeze. That night, the festival fades into silence. Back in his room, Alpha studies the ancient book under a lantern. He feels relieved knowing the scammer's removal has prevented the Lord's unfair demotion. With the tourism revenue also expected to stabilize the estate's finances soon, he realizes he has already achieved his main objective, but his relief quickly fades when he remembers the neighboring country's massive army. Their invasion is supposed to begin in a few months, potentially leading to the Empire's downfall. Studying the prophecies, Alpha realizes that changing the Lord's fate may have caused other events to happen sooner than expected. Rumors of violent clashes along the western border only strengthen his suspicion that war could come early. Knowing Sigma's personality, Alpha fears the Count will abandon his people and charge into battle alone, leaving the territory's kind-hearted residents to suffer. He refuses to sit back and watch that happen. Amused by his own change of heart, the former gambler wonders when he started caring about other people. Still, he grips his record of the future and considers leaving the dangerous territory before things get worse. The next morning, training resumes in the main courtyard. Alpha reviews Visconti's lesson and focuses on shifting his body weight instead of relying on speed. The blonde commander explains that swinging only with his arms makes his attacks slower, especially with his thin frame. Visconti then adjusts Alpha's stance and shows him how proper leg positioning can dramatically increase his striking speed. He demonstrates the technique flawlessly, leaving Alpha stunned as he tries to memorize every movement. When Visconti tells him to copy it, Alpha insists that an ordinary commoner cannot reproduce something so advanced. He tries anyway, twists his body incorrectly, and face plants into the dirt, drawing Theta's attention. Theta kneels beside him and uses her healing power to ease his pain. Alpha thanks her for watching him fail every day, while she reminds him that feeling helpless is part of growing stronger. Still frustrated, Alpha wonders how an amateur like him is supposed to survive among such monsters. The Imperial Knight Commander then approaches and praises Alpha's performance during the previous exam. Alpha brushes it off, admitting that his victory was mostly a visual trick. The Knight is shocked to learn that Alpha has barely begun sword training. As Alpha sits defeated in the dirt, the commander recognizes his natural talent for high-speed combat. Alfred then invites him to join the estate's training sessions, explaining that isolating himself would hinder his growth. The commander initially refuses, saying that simply observing the border army is already a privilege. Alpha counters that Sigma would not care about such formalities and proposes a technical exchange between the two factions. The commander, intrigued by the idea, agrees to formally request Sigma's approval. Watching him approach the Lord with rigid formality, Alpha quietly congratulates himself for disguising his manipulation as friendly advice. The meeting between the Empire's greatest warriors and the Border Lord proceeds smoothly without bureaucratic trouble. Theta watches in amazement, surprised that a squad led by the infamous cold-blooded executioner can be so peaceful and welcoming. Watching the top commanders casually chat, the former gambler smirks and concludes that Oda's constant management is probably the only reason the castle hasn't fallen apart. The head butler calmly explains that he handles nearly everything in the territory for Sigma, balancing strictness with patience. Sitting beside him, Alpha agrees that Sigma deserves credit for knowing how to delegate, pointing out that both the locals and knights recognize it. Theta rests her face in her hands, quietly observing how much Alpha genuinely cares about the people of the border. Her comment catches him off guard. For a moment he freezes before a distant voice calls his name. Alpha quickly gets up to meet the officers, trying to convince himself that he has no attachment to the territory. Determined to leave, he decides he will be gone by tomorrow night. With the military officers, Alpha asks about the difference between remaining a servant and becoming a retainer knight. Oda explains that his daily duties would remain mostly unchanged, but his social status would rise significantly. Retainer knights train as warriors under their lord, facing monsters and military campaigns alongside experienced leaders until they become full knights. Exceptional warriors may even receive land for their achievements. Alpha weighs the offer, knowing his real goal is still to escape before the coming war. Oda reminds him that the promotion comes from the commander's joint recommendation and urges him to appreciate the opportunity. Alpha formally thanks them but declines. The Imperial Knight is stunned, pointing out how rarely a commoner receives such an opportunity. Alpha claims he never cared about advancement and is perfectly satisfied with his current life. Then Sigma approaches and asks if something about the military position is troubling him. Alpha looks away and admits that protecting himself matters more to him than anything else. The commander is disappointed, saying he believed Alpha shared their desire to support Sigma in the future. Under the Count's expectations, Alpha lowers his head before finally losing his temper. He reminds Sigma of the trial against his uncle, accusing him of being willing to throw away everything, including his title. Alpha angrily asks how his subordinates are supposed to support a lord who does not even care about keeping his own position. Oda immediately scolds him for speaking so disrespectfully, but Alpha refuses to back down. He asks who else would have the courage to tell Sigma the truth directly. His shouting draws the attention of everyone nearby. Furious and in tears, Alpha accuses Sigma of taking the easy way out by being willing to abandon his territory. He demands to know who would stop the Count from making reckless decisions that could leave his people behind. Oda freezes at the raw emotion in Alpha's words, while even the Imperial commander recognizes how unusual it is for someone to challenge the feared warrior so openly. The soldiers and workers begin to understand the weight behind Alpha's question. Who would fight to protect them if their lord abandoned the territory? Wiping his eyes, Alpha curses himself for crying in front of everyone. Theta watches him with deep emotion as he wipes his face and tries to regain his composure. Finally, Alpha points firmly at the ground and demands that Sigma make a permanent oath. With his expression unchanged, Sigma listens as Alpha boldly challenges him to swear that he will never again consider abandoning his position as the ruler of the border. Silence takes over the courtyard as Alpha's demand echoes through the crowd. Clenching his fists, he warns Sigma that he can take his head for the disrespect if he wants. Ogun and Theta watch in disbelief at the commoner's nerve to demand an oath in exchange for his life. Alpha insists Sigma swear immediately in front of everyone who serves him. The Count closes his eyes, calmly processing every word, while Oda panics, certain the boy has signed his own death warrant. Sigma then orders his sword. He draws the heavy blade and releases a crushing aura across the courtyard. Oda fears Alpha's insults will bring the death penalty. Feeling the killing intent, Alpha braces himself as Sigma approaches with the naked blade, but instead of striking, Sigma drives the sword into the ground and kneels before him. Alpha closes his eyes, expecting death, then opens them in complete shock. Ogun bursts out laughing at the boy's loyalty and bold reprimand, then kneels beside his lord. Visconti follows, ruffling Alpha's hair and praising his courage. Soon the workers, soldiers, and villagers begin kneeling as well, forming a massive crowd behind Alpha. Sigma grips the sword planted in the earth, closes his eyes, and calls on the heavens to witness his oath. He vows to shape the future of his allies and devote his life to protecting his people and their peace. The commanders raise their voices, pledging their swords, while the workers echo their devotion. The entire courtyard erupts into a unified war cry for their lord. Alpha stands at the center, stunned by the scale of what he has triggered. Visconti then reminds him about the retainer knight offer and asks for his final answer. Overwhelmed by the moment, Alpha finally gives in and accepts. Kneeling with the others, he realizes that receiving a second chance like this makes running away a waste. Sigma looks at his newest retainer with quiet approval, while Alpha sincerely vows to give everything he has to protect the territory. Years later, Claude would remember that this was the day the Empire's strongest Border Knights squad was born. The scene shifts to a peaceful afternoon at the territory's vast lake. Alpha sits alone in a small wooden boat, fishing while sorting through his thoughts. After pledging his loyalty to Sigma, his goals are clear: develop the border territory, raise Sigma's reputation throughout the Empire, and ultimately win the war against the neighboring nation. The final goal seems almost impossible, but his thoughts are interrupted when his bobber suddenly sinks. Alpha reels in the line and feels enormous resistance. Determined to start with whatever he can handle, he keeps pulling until he finally hauls a huge fish onto the boat. Unnoticed behind him, a violent whirlpool churns across the lake. Holding up his catch, Alpha promises himself that he will rewrite the tragic future recorded in the history book. He also recognizes the lake as an excellent source of resources. Suddenly, a strange sound catches his attention. Looking toward the shore, he spots someone frantically waving from the wooden pier. The worker screams for Alpha to paddle, but Alpha assumes he's just excited about the huge catch. Despite the villagers' frantic warnings, he fails to understand the danger until a massive explosion of water erupts behind the boat. The impact launches the boat into the air, shattering it into splinters and throwing Alpha into the lake. A gigantic aquatic beast disappears beneath the surface, leaving debris floating behind. Clinging to a piece of wood, Alpha coughs up water and struggles to understand what happened. Once he reaches safety, the worker explains that the lake is home to a magical guardian beast, making it extremely dangerous at all times. Soaked and freezing as he walks along the shore, Alpha realizes how lucky he is to have survived. Back at the estate, Oda finds Alpha dripping wet and sarcastically asks if he went swimming. Shivering and sneezing, Alpha apologizes for his mistake. Concerned about his health, Oda orders him to change immediately. Later, Alpha rests in his new private room, enjoying the benefits of his promotion. Two knocks sound at the door, and Theta enters, joking about the rumors that he pretended to be sick to avoid sword training. She quickly admits she was only teasing, but explains that everyone is genuinely worried about how exhausted he looks. She lists his exhausting routine, caring for the horses, sparring with the cavalry, scouting the territory alone, and working as Sigma's personal attendant. Alpha defends himself, explaining that his sword skills still need work and stabilizing the estate's finances remains a priority. With a sincere smile, he admits that he also keeps working around the stables because he genuinely enjoys being there. Theta is surprised by his honesty and accepts that there is no arguing with his stubbornness. She then asks why he went to the dangerous lake. Alpha explains his plans to build a pier, a swimming area, and a commercial fishing hub, turning the region into a major source of tourism and revenue. He also wants to harvest valuable aquatic resources and eventually establish fish farming. Alpha hints that he has another motive behind the plan and confidently predicts that the situation will become a risky but exciting game. His serious pose is ruined when he suddenly sneezes loudly. Theta gives him a tissue and points out that he has caught a severe cold. She also stresses that the lake beast needs to be dealt with, although even the elite knights have never figured out how to defeat a giant magical creature underwater. Worried about the locals, Theta suggests avoiding the lake entirely rather than risking unnecessary casualties. Alpha refuses, insisting that he will handle the beast himself if necessary. His confidence lasts only a moment before severe dizziness hits. His legs give out, and he collapses onto the bed, sending Theta into a panic. 3 days later, Alpha is still bedridden with a high fever and difficulty breathing. Oda reports that neither medicinal herbs nor the local doctor have been able to reduce his condition. When Alpha wakes, he apologizes and promises to return to work the next day, but Oda immediately shuts him down and orders him to do nothing. He then politely asks Theta to return to her quarters so the maids can care for Alpha. Theta remains worried, wondering why her divine healing magic has had no effect. She begins to suspect that the aquatic beast poisoned Alpha during the attack. Oda tries to reassure her, suggesting that the lack of other symptoms means Alpha may simply be suffering from extreme exhaustion after pushing himself too hard. He also asks Theta to leave, fearing the church could condemn the estate if she becomes ill. Realizing the responsibility involved, Theta agrees but insists they contact her immediately if Alpha's condition worsens. Meanwhile, in the castle's war room, the territory's top military commanders gather to discuss the lake beast. Visconti explains the danger, warning that even a single tactical mistake could result in devastating casualties for the army. The military commanders gather in the war room as the lake threat becomes their next major problem. Ogun insists they have no choice but to confront the magical beast directly. Visconti agrees, pointing out that if they do nothing, Alpha will inevitably try to fight it alone. Meanwhile, Alpha remains bedridden, suffering from a severe fever. Confused and frustrated, he feels chaotic energy coursing through his body and hates being unable to help the territory. Refusing to accept defeat, he summons all his willpower and confronts the mysterious illness head-on. His determination triggers an intense burst of red light and heat. The next morning, Alpha suddenly wakes up feeling completely fine. Looking at his hand, he discovers a tiny flame-like creature resting on his palm. Although it looks like fire, it produces no heat. Remembering a passage from the ancient tome about spirits born from the world's elemental forces, Alpha realizes that the creature is a fire elemental spirit. He tests its abilities with a piece of paper, and the spirit immediately burns it with a small flame. Excited by the result, Alpha treats it like a magical lighter and spends some time playing with his new companion. When Theta enters the room, Alpha proudly tries to introduce her to the spirit, only for it to suddenly disappear. Confused, he wonders where it went. Later, Alpha heads into an isolated forest clearing to test the spirit properly. He suspects it may be connected to his body, and wonders whether the lake incident caused him to absorb some magical essence. He even jokes that the fever might have been the process of giving birth to the creature before deciding to focus on testing its abilities. He orders the spirit to burn a dry branch, and it immediately obeys. A powerful fireball shoots from its mouth and strikes the target perfectly. Impressed by its accuracy, Alpha increases the distance and sets up several targets across the clearing. The spirit continues hitting them without losing precision. Seeing its potential, Alpha begins thinking about combining the spirit's flames with his own wind magic.